Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and a recent investigation into my past has proved that I was then as well. Well, it seems to me that Musical Talk is a well-named programme, because I think the best episodes are when it's just someone from the Musical Talk team sitting down with someone else involved in musical theatre in some way and having a chat and letting that conversation roll on to see where it goes. And the dynamic of the people talking often carries it into exciting and unexpected areas, or well-trodden areas, but with a new vantage point. And so Musical Talk does what it says on the tin, as they used to say in the adverts. It's a show where we talk about musicals. So far, so obvious. But I'm just trying to remind us of our core values. Because that's what we're going to have today, an absolutely wonderful conversation which meanders all over the world of musical theatre, both contemporary and historic, and which, listening to it again, I have found absolutely fascinating, as much as I did at the time when I recorded it. Well, who is the subject of today's interview? His name is Cameron Smith, and you may not have heard of him, but I'm hoping you may have read some of his work, because he is, I think in the broadest sense, a musical theatre journalist. A contributor to Musical Theatre Review, which is an online website and also a printed magazine about musical theatre, and reviewing it, I think they've made it pretty plain what they're about as well. And also he has one of my favourite musical theatre websites. It's called Middlebrow Musicals, and in it Cameron writes essays about any aspect of musical theatre that takes his fancy. Now, this conversation was recorded a while ago, but I don't think that in any way diminishes the interest of what comes up in the conversation. And at the end of the programme, I'll give you details of how you can look at the Musical Theatre Review website, i.e. where it is, and also Cameron's own Middlebrow Musicals blog spot. And looking at how that blog came into being in the first place is where we start today's conversation. But we'll be travelling through the stations Mark Stephen Sondheim and Andrew Lloyd Webber before we've finished. Here's Cameron Smith. Musical Talk. Cameron, it's a delight to meet you, and more than just being a delight, it's a pleasure and something of excitement to me, because you are responsible for Middlebrow Musicals, which is my favourite musical theatre blog online. So tell me, how did you get to be the proud father of a bonny bouncing blog?
It was about 4 years ago. It was 2009 I started it. Actually, to begin with, I was just interested in blogs. I was reading blogs online, and I was just interested in how you went about setting one up, just out of curiosity. And so I did set one up, and having set one up, I thought, I better write something on it.
Empty blog, yes.
And musical theatre is sort of the only subject I sort of know a little bit about, and so ended up writing on that. And so
you're not hiding your light under a bushel. As anyone who's read your website would immediately realise you know rather more than just a little.
No, well, a little bit here and there. So it's just been continuing since then.
So this is really interesting, because you're telling me that actually when it comes to the chicken and the egg, it was actually the website first, the blog first, with the idea of what to put in it second.
Pretty much, yeah.
So it's not a burning passion at all, then?
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, I had done a little bit of writing before, but never really obviously had a chance to publish it anywhere, just sort of my own interest. But it is a passion. But yeah, when it actually very first started, it was actually the blog I was interested in finding out about first. But as it's developed and as it's grown, I've written more and more, and it's quite nice now, having done it for 4 years. I've got quite a sort of decent archive on there, so it feels like a bit more substantial.
Oh, there's meat on your bone, if you pardon the expression. But people are going to ask, because I've always wondered this, it has a very distinctive title, which is Middlebrow Musicals.
Right.
Obviously it trips off the tongue and it's quite amusing, but forgive me, how did you plump for that?
Yeah, well, again, it was sort of, I chose it quite quickly to begin with, because you just when you first set up a blog, you have to choose the title and then you can't change it. Yeah. And I didn't really plan to do it for 4 years, so I just sort of chose it quite quickly. But the word Middlebrow actually came from a piece by my favourite reviewer or favourite critic of musical theatre. He's a guy called Mark Stein. He wrote a book called Broadway Babies Say Goodnight.
He's one of the great names in musical theatre review when he's not talking about right-wing American politics.
Yeah, yes.
It's an interesting combination. He's a very funny man.
Very interesting guy, very funny guy, and pretty perceptive, I find, on his stuff. And he wrote for the New Criterion magazine in America, I think, and I think it was one of those reviews he did. I can't remember what he was reviewing now, but I just remember the title was called 3 Cheers for the Middlebrow. And I just saw that and thought, Middlebrow, that's quite a good word. But it actually sort of sums up the blog reasonably well, in that the kind of musicals that I'm sort of interested in and like tend to be the sort of middlebrow ones. I mean, it tends to be the sort of West End shows and the Rodgers and Hammerstein type shows. So they are the sort of middlebrow things. And also, when I was sort of thinking about what to write about, and particularly about how to write about musicals, sort of looking online at the time, it's probably changed a bit now, but at the time I found sort of things at two different ends. At one end you found sort of fan sites of a particular show or a particular performer, something like that.
Adina Menzel, for example. just plucking one randomly from the public's mind.
Possibly shows to do with Green Witches, I don't know. Which are great, but they're sort of chatty in their forums and people sort of saying how much they like this stuff.
And I wanted to be specific as well.
And I wanted to be more critical than that. But then at the other end, the other things I occasionally came across online were sort of very academic type journal articles, which were sort of very strange.
The full deconstruction of musical theatre.
Yeah, they talk about like the socio-economic context of Oklahoma, right?
Yes.
Step
too far.
I didn't really want to go down that route, so I wanted something in the middle. And so again, it was not only about middlebrow musicals; it was sort of talking about them in a slightly middlebrow way. So being critical, but without necessarily going the full academic.
Well, I tell you what, it's intelligent, but not distancing. That's what I think your website offers, if you don't mind me saying.
Hopefully, I mean, I hope it will still be readable. I mean, you probably need. There are sort of references and things which you probably need a bit of background knowledge of musicals to know about. But hopefully, even just a casual reader would be able to.
But each and every one of us are on a path. Forgive me. Musical talk has taught me quite a lot of things. And in a way, I'm always interested in anything that sends me off to look up a definition or do further research online, even occasionally Wikipedia, if I'm not being too fussy.
Yeah, it's good old Wikipedia. Where would we do with that?
Yeah. Well, it's a very good place to start, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
But not a very good place to finish. That's the secret of Wikipedia.
I think that's sound advice.
Yes. So, Middlebrow Musicals is christened, and you've got to start filling it with things that you're interested in. You chose musical theatre, but your show is not your website is not a review website, is it? It's actually, and this is what I like about it. So I'm gonna say up straight that it's my favourite musical theatre blog because you set questions and then you answer the questions. It's a series of essays and insights and thoughts. Sometimes in response to other people's essays in newspapers or online. Sometimes your own, and sometimes I agree with them, and sometimes I don't. But they're always well written, they're always cogent, they're always entertaining. And you've also got a very good line in finishing an article. You know how to turn on that last sentence,
Yeah, I mean, I guess, the problem with blogs and blogging is just finding time to do it.
Yes.
And I tend to be sort of a slowish writer anyway, so I'm not like Mark Shenton, who sort of blogs every 5 minutes
Indeed.
on his blog on the
tweeting.
stage.
Yes.
When he's not tweeting, yeah, in between. I think he does both at the same time.
Two thumb Shenton.
Something like that. Yeah, so, I knew I couldn't really do sort of first night reviews or sort of immediate reviews, because I just don't really think like that, and I tend to like to, when I do reviews, I tend to like to step back a bit. They take time, and I like to read the other reviews and listen to the music and get the score if I can, and all these sorts of things. And so the reviews that are on there tend to be of older musicals, not sort of the most current stuff.
Almost classic reviews. What's already proven itself worth talking
trying to go a
about.
little deeper than perhaps a first night review could, and try and understand how the musical works. And the other thing was, it tends to be reactive, so I tend to pick up something that being discussed on Musical Talk, or something I found online.
Ambassador, you flatter me.
Or something I found online, an article, or sometimes a review, and then react to it, rather than, I don't do a huge amount where I'm just sort of coming up with the things myself. Although occasionally I do that, where just something comes to me and I think, that would be an interesting question to ask.
Today's thought nugget.
Thought for the day, yeah.
I like that element of cogitation and thoughtfulness that goes into your articles, because it isn't, they're not knee-jerk reactions, they are considered essays almost. choice. You know, yours. I believe Stephen Fry tried to coin the phrase "blessé" a few years ago for the blog essay.
Yeah, I suppose. They're a little bit more reflective than just a knee-jerk reaction. I just think that's the way I sort of think about musicals, and I think they're also, because I'm sort of interested in writing musicals myself as well, and so I'm quite interested from the writer's point of view.
Yes.
I mean, I do tend to think about them in terms of how they're written and how they're constructed, probably a bit more than I think about them how they're performed or even produced. So I do tend to sort of look from the writer's perspective a little bit more, which again is something I don't think is all you always pick up on in something like a first night review.
Absolutely not. I suppose my question then is, when you're talking about writing, do you mean the creative process overall for musicals, or are you talking about the words over music? You know, I mean, I don't mind saying I love musicals and therefore I love music, but I can't pretend to have any skill in music, but I do pretend, and I certainly pretend, but I pretend to have skills in words and language and drama and structure of drama. So in that sense, I'm very much more connected with what I've seen written down rather than those little black dots that seem to have tails.
No, I mean the whole thing. I'm interested in drama and how it's structured. I'm interested in the lyrics. I'm a musician myself. I play music and read music, and so sort of try and get the whole thing in.
Well, I was going to say, because if you were asking me, I would have said that there are a number of entries which actually relate to the music, which I find fascinating, because you're in an area that I can enjoy, but I find it harder to grapple with on a forensic level. Music, you know, music, unfortunately for me, is something which I have to take as a whole. I like it or I don't like it, and sometimes I can work out why, but I don't have the scalpel.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an okay musician, but I can read music, I can write music a little bit. I play a couple of instruments, but so I can get a score like a piano lead sheet. I couldn't really manage an orchestral score, but I can get a piano lead sheet, and I can figure out. Or try and figure out why a particular song works and what is the musical thing that makes it work. And so sometimes blog on that. The only difficulty of that is then trying to put that into words is often very difficult. Whereas obviously writing about lyrics and about dialogue and drama structure and that sort of thing, it's a bit more natural. But actually, it's quite a tough challenge to write about music and to go through the details of why one note works and another note doesn't, without sort of getting lost in the details.
Yeah, that's easy, where you could get into the high academic end of the market, I think.
Yes,
Charles Strauss once said to me that he thought the people who wrote great music are the ones who mishear it, the ones who do something slightly different. And then in Edinburgh this year, I interviewed a man who was doing a tribute show to the late great Jake Thackeray. And he said to me that Jake Thackeray played the guitar in a way like no one else because he had bigger hands than anyone else. So when he was looking for an unusual chord, he could do it because he could find chords which most people couldn't meet or make just because their fingers weren't long enough to do it. And I'm really interested in this idea that great music or interesting music is actually slightly off the beaten track. It's the non-conventional that makes it fabulous, which would explain Jedward.
Well, I suppose something has to, doesn't it? but no, I mean, it's a really interesting idea, the interesting of mishearing music, and that's how you come up with something, because and it gives me great hope, because I haven't actually got a great musical ear. When I was learning music at school, I was very lucky. I was surrounded by people who were very good musicians, had perfect pitch, and they could hear something and then immediately repeat it or write it down. And I could never do that. That was the one bit of music that I really, really struggled with. So it gives me great hope that I might be able to mishear stuff. And
I mean, obviously, it'd be silly to say that all composers are imbeciles when it comes to music, but you do immediately think of people like Irving Berlin, who could only change the key on his piano because he had a sort of gear stick. You know, aware of this?
Yes, yeah, he had some sort of special piano constructed where he could only play. Apparently, he took one look at the piano, never had a music lesson in his life, and then I saw there were fewer black notes and white notes. I said, I'll just use the black notes. That's going to be easier. And then later on, I think he had a piano constructed where you could pull a lever and you'd play on the black notes and it would play in a different key. You pull it again, still play on the black notes and play in another key again.
I believe it's been presented to the American nation in some collection somewhere, the Irving Berlin geared piano.
Yeah.
And of course, then you've got some people like Lionel Barr, who famously couldn't write a note of it, just hummed it into a dictaphone and let someone else sort it all out.
But I think this is one of the. I think I wrote something about this. This is one of the most interesting things about musicals. Is the democracy of it.
Yeah.
Anyone can have a crack, really. At one end you have the Irving Berlin, who not only didn't have any music lessons, but was the son of an immigrant,
Became a singing waiter,
and then has gone on to put in all these amazing phrases into the American language, which is essentially a second language. So at one end you have this, and then at the other end you have people like Leonard Bernstein, symphonic conductor, and highly trained musician, or Cole Porter, again, he was a highly trained musician as well as a great wordsmith. And the fact that musical theatre can sort of accommodate this sort of spectrum of people and different people is one of the things that I think is fascinating about it.
Which brings us to the point that I have noticed more and more in interviews I've been carrying out, which is that musical theatre is, it's a very understandable term. It's musical with song, it's drama with songs, essentially, in some form. But it's used as a genre. And is it really, when people talk about musical theatre, they use it quite often disparagingly. And then people people often say when they've written a show, but it's not your normal musical theatre, and then they say there's no jazz hands.
No.
But there's not many jazz hands in Stephen Sondheim, as far as I've noticed. So it's almost too wide a term to be useful, except it is the broadest brush for a kind of thing, but is it a genre? I suppose my question to you is, does the term musical theatre have any genuine meaning, or is it just too generic a word for a whole series of different types that fall within it? There's no right or wrong answer, by the way, but I will be marking your score.
Right. Okay.
Show your work.
I shall be very careful. But I think, for me, I think it is a distinct thing. I know on the podcast we've talked a lot about opera and musicals and what the difference is and this kind of thing. And at school when I was studying music, I always was taught that opera is a broad brush definition is a drama through music. And I think if that's the definition of opera, then the definition of musical is drama through song. And it's really the fact of the song that is what makes it distinctive. Possibly you could say drama through song and dance, but I'll stick with through song. And there is a distinction between a song and, say, an operatic aria. And it's to do with the balance of the words and the music, I think. So in a song, it's much more a 50-50 partnership.
I think it has to be, yeah.
Whereas in an opera, it's really the music. Obviously the words are important for getting the information about the story across and telling the audience what's going on, but really the drama of the opera is being told through the music, which makes it a more abstract thing, and it's much more just to do with sort of raw feelings and emotions, particularly grand opera and Verdi and Puccini and so on. But I think that's why we talk about Verdi's Otello, but then when it comes to musicals, we talk about Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma. It's
Gilbert and Sullivan onwards from that.
Gilbert and Sullivan, and it's because there's more of a balance, there's more of a partnership with the words and the music.
I think that has to be right, because people will listen to opera in non-English languages, because most of them are written in non-English languages, and yet very few people will be prepared to sit through The King and I in Spanish if they don't speak Spanish. I certainly wouldn't. And indeed, I know a few years ago that Arthur Lawrence, one of the last things he did before he died, was to direct a version of West Side Story.
That's right.
Where the Puerto Ricans all spoke Spanish.
That's right, yeah.
And I don't know how well it did, but certainly I wouldn't go and see it, because for me, I'm as much interested in the narrative drive, which is for me propelled through lyrics and the clever usage of language, than just the music.
I mean, one of my favourite quotes, I think it's from Yip Harburg, the lyricist of...
E.P. Harburg?
Yip, yeah, I call him Yip. Somewhere Over the Rainbow, the lyricist for that. I think it was him who said that music helps you feel a feeling and words help you think a thought. And so with a song, you can feel a thought. And I've always thought that's kind of what makes songs distinctive, and particularly musicals distinctive, as opposed to something like opera. It's this idea of feeling a thought. And if you think of, think of a classic song like I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas, if you say the words, then you get the thought, so you get the mental image of a white Christmas, of snow on the ground and the cold and everything. But then if you think of the melody, that sort of little chromatic melody at the end, it gives you the feeling, it gives you the yearning, the nostalgia, and so when you hear them together, it makes you feel a thought. And it's very hard, and because it's a well-written song, it's very hard to separate those two things. You can't really think about, once you know the song, you can't really think about the melody without the words, or the words without the melody. And it's that sort of integration of words and music that I think I'm most interested in.
I agree with you, but I do have a question there, because I think context must have something to do with it, and more than we let on, because I've noticed in recent years, and this is something that horror films have done, is they've taken perfectly innocent children's songs, i.e. with choruses of children singing, and recontextualise them, so that is now the spookiest, creepiest thing you can possibly hear. I actually went to a toy museum recently in London, the Pollock's Toy Museum, a very excellent place to go, but for some reason or other I could hear old recordings of children, like Nymphs and Shepherds and that kind of thing.
Right, okay.
Maybe not Nymphs and Shepherds because that's so wholesome and lovely, but it's that kind of thing. And the person I was with just said, "Oh, this is really creepy." And for him, who sees a lot more horror than I do, he doesn't hear the charm of the 1930s choirs. He hears the heartless creepiness, as he sees it, of child choirs.
Oh, right, okay.
But that cannot have been how they were originally written. That's something that's been recontextualised into them later on. I mean, I'm using an unusual example here, I think. But
Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, when I'm talking about the words and music being integrated, I mean, that's just for the song. So then when you move into the drama through song, the musical theatre aspect of it, then the context becomes important. And so then you're adding another layer of drama through song, not just writing songs on its own.
of course, that's leading us, I think, inexorably towards the boggy waters that are jukebox musicals.
Okay.
Because they're a recontextualisation of a song. And also, we were talking about Middlebrow musicals. I think jukebox musicals are, if we're talking class and brow, then they're more lower brow, in my view. And
yeah, we should say that when I talk about Middlebrow and such like, it's not meant in terms of a judgment of quality or anything.
Oh, no.
Or in terms of, you can have good lowbrow stuff, you can have bad highbrow stuff. It's nothing like that. It's just a descriptive term. But I think you're right. I mean, I haven't been to see many of the jukebox musicals. They're not particularly my cup of tea. But
no, but they've all been turned into films, and they're all coming your way if you want them or not.
I have watched Mamma Mia through a cushion. It's quite
That's
painful.
exactly how you should hear it.
It was tough.
Oh, the Bros does do a good job. I always think, no, Piers Brosnan.
I think that was the point. I had to make a cup of tea. But yeah,
bake a cake and roast a pig as well.
I mean, I'm not so much interested in it because I don't think you mentioned that they're recontextualised. I mean, the point about them is that they can't really be integrated in the same way that a new musical can be. And as far as I can tell, they're integrated in a very arbitrary way.
Shoehorny.
Yeah, and so yeah, I think that does make them more towards the lowbrow end of things, but they're simply put on as entertainment. So,
Mamma Mia isn't telling me much, I think.
No.
Although, of course, I've made this observation before, it still has some of the great tropes of, indeed, opera in this case. There are the three women from the Magic Flute.
Well, yes, yeah,
So,
I guess.
You can draw your parallels carefully.
Got the rule of three, but no, I mean, I think the success of jukebox musicals is basically that it gives people a chance to hear live and perform very well the songs that they love from the albums.
Yeah.
I think it's basically a glorified karaoke thing.
Yeah,
which,
it's a concert with a story.
I mean, probably done very, very well, and obviously some work and some don't, and some are done better than others.
Viva forever. Viva till Wednesday.
Again, I missed that one. But
you'll be the only one who does.
But yeah, I think that's the appeal of them, and so I think that they have a shelf life. I mean, I think that they're going to run someday. They're going to run out of old back catalogues to plunder. I think because you've got to have a back catalogue like a Queen or like a ABBA, who's actually quite substantial. And there's quite a lot of good stuff. You can get good 15 to 20 songs of good material, which is worth spending the money and making the effort of creating a story around.
But suggesting the Black Lace jukebox musical may be a long time coming.
Maybe. But
it's my old friend Agadoo. I wonder what adventures he'll be getting up to. He seems to be doing a lot with a pineapple and a tree.
You've been thinking about this too much, Sasa. I think I'm secretly working on that one. But But yeah, so I think they'll have a shelf life, and as I say, it's not really sort of my area that I sort of think about. But so in terms of the development of musicals and the future of musicals, I think at some point those will come to an end, and we'll have to be looking at sort of the dramatically integrated musical.
So is it sensible even to talk about the future of musicals? Do you want to hazard a guess as to where you think they might go? I mean, bearing in mind there are so many different genres, it's impossible to say. Can I say immediately, by the way, I think Sondheim, who's fantastic and lovely, and I enjoy his work, will prove to be a cul-de-sac.
Yeah, I think I'd probably go with you on that. I'm a slightly odd Sondheim fan in that my general reading about it is that most people who like Sondheim tend to like the later stuff, that, including Sondheim himself. That they're a bit iffy about the early stuff, particularly where he wrote lyrics with other people, and I think he really got going with Hal Prince, and then sort of maybe the best stuff is Sunday in the Park and Sweeney Todd.
But I'd rather listen to a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum than I would to Roadshow.
Right. Well, I haven't heard Roadshow, but I mean, I tend to be a Sondheim fan in reverse. So I actually like the early, a bit like Woody Allen, like the earlier funnier stuff, less so. So
yeah. when does he fall off the plank for you then? What's the last great Sondheim show?
Well, I kind of like West Side Story and Gypsy. The lyrics were, I think, about as good as it gets as a set of lyrics for a Broadway show. I like Funny Thing. I sort of like Half of Company, but to be honest, after that,
If only two's company, that means you can only like one.
To be honest, after that, I'm a little bit take it or leave it.
Really?
After that, I mean, I enjoy them, and you certainly appreciate them, and I really appreciate when he talks about lyrics. I think he's probably must be about the most knowledgeable and
when he's not slagging off other lyricists, I agree with you.
Yeah, I even like him when he slags off other lyricists, but I think he's incredibly clear-sighted about how musicals work. I don't think there's anyone else who's sort of
I think he's incredibly clear-sighted about the kind of musicals he writes.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, he is, and that in itself is quite interesting because quite often the writers themselves aren't the best people to ask about their shows because they're too close to it, and it's interesting that he has that kind of distance from it, and that's what I sometimes get with some of his musicals, that there's almost a slight distance. He's not quite giving everything to
I think that's often been said. Sometimes that's described as smugness, but actually I think it's just but also there's a fear, isn't there, that they are deemed to be sort of, I'm going to say, the higher brow end of musical theatre, and some people find any overt expression of intelligence to be distancing, which I think, basically there's no dance in Sondheim, and people think therefore it's taking itself too seriously, which I think is silly, but there we are.
I don't know, I don't think it's that. I don't think we should underestimate people. I think you're right about the highbrow stuff. I think he probably alone has, I would say, has writes highbrow stuff. I mean, although
I think the Cuser, by the way, joins him. I personally.
I'm not too well known on the Cuser stuff, but yeah, I think that's probably been his main. Certainly in this country, I don't know quite how he's seen in Broadway, although I suspect it's in similar terms. But certainly in this country, I think that's been his main contribution. Is he's taken musicals upmarket, if you like. I mean, he's had a prom where they played dedicated to his music. Radio 3 has made him Composer of the Week, this sort of thing, and he's very much a theatre person's composer as well. I mean, he's say Sondheim to most people, and they won't know his name, they won't know his music either, possibly apart from Send in the Clouds.
Yes.
That's and it's strange that he's obviously really big within the theatre world, and yet hasn't quite made it into popular culture.
He also appeals to a kind of theatrical snobbery as well, because a lot of people say that they like Sondheim, but they don't like musicals. It's their way of liking musicals without having to also confess to, state fair.
Yeah, you hear that a lot, and.
Well, I'm going to name drop horribly, except I'm not going to say the name, but I was talking to a very senior London politician recently who told me exactly that. He was saying that he's always completely eschewed musicals his entire life and was dragged to a Sondheim by a friend, and it was revelatory to him. So he goes to all the Sondheims, but he won't touch any other musical.
Yeah, no, I think there is a little bit of that where you're sort of allowed to like Sondheim, but you're a bit sniffy about Hammerstein or something, or lots of other people. But there is a little bit of that. But what you said about him being, in terms of the future music, a little bit of a cul-de-sac, I wonder if that's interesting as well. It's something I was just thinking about recently, in relation to it was in relation to something I wrote about West Side Story, and in fact something he wrote about West Side Story in his collected lyrics, where he said that basically West Side Story isn't. People say, oh, it's about, it's different because it's about gang violence and it's about, these very tough, sort of hardened people and juvenile delinquency and this sort of thing. And in his collected lyrics, he says, it's nothing about that. It's not sociological. We didn't know anything about that. It was about, what it was about theatre. It was about people coming together from different places. Jerome Robbins from the ballet and Leonard Bernstein from the symphony orchestra. And
breathing life into a 16th century story.
And collaborating, and that's what it was really about. It wasn't really any sort of representation of life in the gritty streets of New York. Yes. It was just about theatre, and I get that impression with a lot of his work. In the end, a lot of it is not just about theatre, but it's art about art, which maybe that's where this slight feeling that's a little bit of a cul-de-sac at times, not with everything, but a little bit of a cul-de-sac, that it's not really sort of reaching out in quite the same way that other shows do.
Also, who are the real heirs to Sondheim? People talk about Jason Robert Brown, but Jason Robert Brown isn't Sondheim. Jason Robert Brown is Jason Robert Brown. Anyone else?
I don't know. I think possibly. I don't know too much because I don't know so much about the Broadway composer. But I mean, certainly you hear a lot of, like you say, writers who are obviously influenced by Sondheim, but then I think they're influenced in a slightly shallower way. They don't quite, get to grips with Sondheim, and so I think they're influenced to the extent where this sort of kind of cynicism about musical theatre, where you do something that's very cynical or biting or satirical, and then on top of that you write a jolly, happy song. Yeah. And so it's sort of almost sort of taking a swipe at musical theatre at the same time as presenting whatever song it is. And Sondheim does do that, but he does it in such subtler ways. Yeah. And there is this kind of, you do get this feeling I get this feeling when I listen to Sondheim songs, that there's a sort of a love-hate relationship with the tradition which he has inherited. There is this sort of tension with it. But because he knows and loves the tradition so much, he can sort of do that. Whereas I think people who aren't from that tradition, maybe more British writers, sort of misread that a little bit, perhaps.
I always think in some ways that Sondheim writes with a scalpel, where many of his contemporaries write with a trowel. But the thing about a scalpel is, of course, you can cut to it as well as mend with it. So I think you're right that he's a great. He does a great forensic post-mortem on the golden age of musical theatre, if such a thing can be said to exist. Whilst also he doesn't embody it, but he represents an aspect of it.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's the tension. He sort of represents. This is the tradition he's inherited, but at the same time he kind of rejects it as well.
He does.
And that's the sort of tension that he gets. But I mean, the thing with that is he obviously writes a lot of pastiche numbers, but with pastiche numbers you really need the devil's in the detail. And so he doesn't just write, a pastiche musical theatre number. He'll write a Dorothy Fields lyric with a Gershwin tune, this sort of thing, and you think, wow.
Well, Follies is absolutely full of that. If you want to see him at his pastiching best, and when he does his Ira Gershwin, you're in the presence of.
Yeah, you can sort of
when you realise he doesn't like Ira Gershwin. That's the thing. And there's he does a great piece of Gilbertian patter in Pacific Overtures, and he hates Gilbert.
Yeah. Yes, yeah.
Or rather, no, he hates Coward. He finds Gilbert boring.
That's right. Yeah, so, came up in his lyric book again.
I don't think there's an old Coward style lyric in a Sondheim. I haven't found that yet. Cole Porter always used to
I don't think so. But I think that's the difference between when he does it, he's so embedded in the tradition, knows it so well, that when he does a pastiche, it's a detailed pastiche. Whereas I think when others try it, you're just getting a generic sound, and it's less interesting because of that.
Next question then, although it stems a little bit from that, because you were talking about being part of the American tradition and being part of the British tradition. Are you able to give me what makes one the British tradition? What is the British tradition, and what makes it different from the Broadway tradition?
I don't know if I can, but I don't know.
Wasn't expecting a full answer on that, because I think that's a very difficult question.
I think the first thing I'd say is probably less of a tradition.
Yeah.
In that you can sort of, when you look at the Broadway stuff, you can sort of draw a line from Gershwin through to Rodgers and Hart, through to Rodgers and Hammerstein, through to Lerner and Lowe, and so on. On to Kander and Ebb as well, and on to Sondheim. There's sort of a story there that sort of makes sense when you read the history of it. There isn't quite the same, I think, in British musical theatre. There are just sort of these things that pop up, with Gilbert and Sullivan, and then Ivor Novello, and then Lionel Bart, and then Lloyd Webber, and so on. So it's patchier, I think. It's not quite as traditional, and you can't draw lines so easily from one to the other.
Well, we've discussed this on your blog, in fact, which is that I think you can trace the world of opera and operetta as being the much truer British tradition of musical theatre. Now, it doesn't always hold up all the way, and you do some very good forensic on my theory. But, funnily enough, I think you found a different weak spot to the one I did. My theory is essentially that Gilbert and Sullivan begats the Lionel Monktons, who are the Edwardian masters of operetta, who were still going vastly strong all the way through the First World War years. This is the 20s. And then you get Ivor Novello coming along and taking their tradition further and making it more and more lush and romantic. And then he drops dead in 1951, and you have to wait for Andrew Lloyd Webber to start again, not in the 70s but in his 80s shows. So that's the gap I think you've got. I like to bridge, but I see Andrew Lloyd Webber as an operettarist and not as a musical theatrist, which I know you had more trouble with.
Yeah.
But I'd just like to say I've got one problem with my link, which is actually, and it's earlier on, which is Gilbert and Sullivan to Lionel Monckton. Now, no one knows anything about Lionel Monckton. I love his work, but most people won't be able to whistle all the hits from the Sunshine Girl or whatever it was, the Quaker Girl. Although you will know one or two of his songs, like Up from the Arcadians, just because you will know them by accident. But and I'm such a silly when the sun goes down. Do you know that as well? I'm such a silly when the sun goes down, or when the moon goes down. But it's it's from Our Miss Gibbs, 1916. It was the big hit of the year. I tell you, I was there.
Sun or the moon, doesn't matter which.
But the point is, Gilbert and Sullivan are overtly comic. I mean, even Yeoman of the Guard is still within the comic tradition, even though it's the more serious one of the lot. But then you go into Edward German, who's the direct heir of Sullivan, and indeed worked with Sullivan and finished off Sullivan's unfinished last operetta. And then from Edward German you go all the way through to Lionel Monckton. But there's suddenly, and it's Edward German who does it, Edward German takes out all the comedy. So Gilbert and Sullivan are funny because of Gilbert, but the Sullivans without Gilbert are not funny. And the tradition has somehow not come from Gilbert and Sullivan, but come from Sullivan. It was like Gilbert was the funny operettarist, but then they carried on with all the dull ones. Who wrote all these pseudo-serious or romantic ones, which is where we still get our Lloyd Webbers today. That is my theory. I'm not expecting to comment one way or the other, but
I think
it's an idea.
You could probably draw the line from there up to Ivor Novello, and that would probably work, although you would know more about the sort of earlier stuff than that. But I don't think you can really draw it then up to Lloyd Webber, as far as I can tell, because I think that's hanging too much on like Phantom, which obviously is a kind of an operetta-ish.
I think everyone involved in Phantom should be hanging, but that's a bit stating.
But I think that's a one-off. Lloyd Webber is just too musically. He's just too odd to really fit into any tradition. I think.
That's interesting. Why do you say that?
Well, because he doesn't really. I mean, when you read interviews with him, his influences are mainly Richard Rodgers, and you can hear that a little bit in certainly some of the early stuff, but. Well, I'm thinking of he did a show with Tim Rice. The very first show was called The Likes of Us, which wasn't ever produced, although they did do more recently an album of it. They sort of dug it up and did a sort of a kind of jokey kind of album of it, and you can really hear Richard Rodgers there. It's sort of a cross. It's the story of Dr. Bernardo, so it's a Victorian thing. So it's sort of a cross between Oliver and The Sound of Music, which must have been the big hits of the day. And in some of the tunes, they're definitely.
And And yet you wouldn't say Joseph agrees, it was Richard Rodgers, would you?
No, that's the thing. He seems to change, and as well as Richard Rodgers, he also has this very eclectic taste where he was influenced by the Everly Brothers and Elvis Presley, and then at the other end, he's obviously from a classical music family.
Yeah.
So he's influenced by Shostakovich and Puccini and sort of thing. So it's a really strange mix, and this is why I think, no one really. Lloyd Webber's music doesn't really sound like anybody else's music.
Does it sound like Lloyd Webber?
Well, I think it.
Is there a through line that you can hear?
I think that there probably is, but you probably have to listen quite hard. Because I've been listening for a long time. One thing I'm not prepared to do. Listening to his music for quite some time now, that you probably can start hearing certain things.
Problem with, can I just say, my problem with Lloyd Webber is, and this is so unprofound, but I like what I like, but I don't like what I don't like.
Right.
And I actually prefer his earlier stuff to his later stuff, which, pre-Phantom is the golden era for him in my book. Whereas, obviously, there are an awful lot of people who do not agree with that.
No, I think that may well be the case. Certainly, I think something like, I remember hearing Tim Rice say that he thought that of all the shows they wrote, actually the first one, Joseph, was probably the one that's going to last the longest. It'll probably have the longest show. Maybe, yeah.
But yes, I agree. Well, they got the schools market with Joseph, didn't they?
Well, I think that helps. But I think, I think the point about whether he's continuing a line of sort of operetta, I think, as I say, I do think if you took Phantom out and the sequel, Love Never Dies Out, I don't think you'd really see it. And he has never said that he's influenced by composers like Ivan Novello or in that sort of romantic tradition. I think he's much more interested in the sort of more grand opera end of things. So I think he's more interested in Puccini.
And yet, I didn't get Puccini at all when I was watching Phantom of the Opera. My problem with Phantom of the Opera is it had too many roots. There felt like there was a good Gilbert and Sullivan in there just waiting to get out if it had the right person to give it the humour. As it might well have done in its original version with Richard Steelco. I got I did get lots of Ivan Novello lushness and unnecessary, unrequited love and romance. I think it plays a very heightened romantic game dramatically, more than I'm prepared to bear. Actually, it's much more sentimental than I can possibly stomach.
Yeah, but I don't know if musically you would say it's close to Ivan Novello. I don't think. I don't know. I probably don't know the earlier stuff well enough to make a sort of proper comparison. But I think even in something like Phantom, the influence, because he's of a generation later that has been brought up with rock and roll, I think that is probably the difference. And even with something like Phantom of the Opera, which is probably his sort of luscious, most romantic kind of musical, you still get that influence of rock music and that kind of sound.
Well, it's there. I think it'd be silly to deny it. That's true.
And I think that just makes a difference to the sound, which makes it more sort of Lloyd Webber and doesn't quite, makes it a little bit of a break from the tradition.
I'm glad we've had this discussion because, as you know, we do differ on it. But what you say makes perfect sense. The reason I don't quite buy into it yet is because actually I think Lloyd Webber has spawned a whole series of the so-called sort of London musicals, the Les Mis. I know it's not by him, and the Schoenbergs and that kind of stuff, Martin-Guerre, and these things I don't like. They don't appeal to me at all.
I think the main thing
because they're overblown. Actually, I think that's what I'm associating with them.
Yeah, but even then, the interesting thing about the West End shows like those is there aren't very many of them, and this is why I'm not sure when you start talking about a tradition. I'm still not sure there is one, even though they were sort of put together. There aren't many of them when you actually think about it. I think it's just because they were so successful that it sort of appears as if there's
they have more influence than they ought to.
A grouping, but there's actually very few of them. And I think the main thing with Lloyd Webber and also with the Les Mis writers, the main thing they did, I think, was simply to break from the Broadway tradition. It seems to me that was the dominant form and the dominant sound. And then simply to get away from that was actually quite a tricky thing, and they've managed to do that. And it could be that their sound is slightly more European than American.
I think that's fair. I think that's absolutely fair.
And so, I suppose that would... I'm doing myself down here, because this would support your theory.
Let's give and take.
This would support your theory that it's coming more out of the sort of European operetta tradition.
The Frimmels and the Rombergs.
Yeah.
Who of course all go to America in the end.
Yeah, and I think you could maybe say that a bit, but again, with Lloyd Webber in particular, I think he's just too much of a sort of oddball.
Iconoclast is the polite term.
Musically, he's an oddball.
Let's talk about Richard Rodgers then, as you were talking about his heavily influence on Andrew Lloyd Webber, because the man, the British composer who claims that he owes it all to Richard Rodgers is Sandy Wilson.
Oh, really? Okay.
And he's not writing operetta. He's not even writing sort of Broadway musicals. He's writing absolutely Britishy musicals, and I don't just mean The Boyfriend, which is a pastiche. I'm talking about all his works. From the Buccaneer.
But is he claiming now? This is the question with Roger. Which Richard Rodgers is he claiming to take?
Early Rodgers, or as we know it, good Rodgers. People will know my antipathy towards Rodgers and Hammerstein.
Yeah, this would be another case of disagreement. I think I would need to put you into some sort of RNH re-education camp. I'll do the GNS one. You do the RNH one, but
as long as it's got an ampersand in the middle, we'll agree. Musical talk. Well, there we are. That was Cameron Smith and I disagreeing, and agreeing, of course, in various points about musical theatre in that first part of this interview. Needless to say, you can hear part 2 next week, when the conversation ranges equally widely, and we continue to agree and disagree. He is a wonderful gentleman to talk to, and I would love to do it again. However, what about his online work? Well, you can see his contributions to the website Musical Theatre Review at this address, www.musicaltheatrereview.com. And there's a wealth of information on that website which is updated regularly. Cameron's own website, the blog that we were speaking about at the beginning of the programme, Middlebrow Musicals, is currently dormant, but it is still available, and there's 5 years of truly excellent archived material on it, so I still recommend that you go and have a look. And you can by going to this address, middlebrowmusicals.blogspot.co.uk. If you're looking for a thoughtful, well-considered, well-researched, cogently argued series of essays about musical theatre in all its forms, then you could do a lot worse than go to Middlebrow Musicals. It remains my favourite online musical theatre blog. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode, but I do just want to say quickly that it's been a wonderful time for musical theatre at the fringe end of the market in London just recently. I know I've spoken about these shows before, but in the last couple of weeks I saw the Quentin Denton show in its brand new form at Above the Arts in Leicester Square, and it was wonderful. And I must say that Luke Lane really nailed the new interpretation of Quentin Denton. And then, of course, just last night, as I recalled this, I went to the last night performance of Dougal Irvin's masterful The Buskers Opera. Now, I knew I was in for a good show, but I was surprised at how absolutely fabulous it was. Pacey, energetic, brilliantly performed, truly musical, and above all funny. It also eviscerated recent British politics. But, and here's the clever part, in a non-hectoring way. It cast its net widely, no stone was left unturned. It was a truly masterful show. So keep your eye out for any revival of that might come along, and then put your eyes back in again so you can actually see it. Well, for the time being, it's time for me to bid my leave from you. And so I'm going to do that with the time-honoured traditional word of goodbye. And that was me saying it. Goodbye. That was me saying it again. I'll stop now. This episode of Musical Talk, edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2016. And don't forget you can find Musical Talk in all the usual places, including Facebook and Twitter. And if you want to see me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. I think that's one of those things that, you know, in one sense, musical theatre is a term that absolutely describes itself accurately, because it is... My do that one again.
Let's start that again.